Welcome back to Port Elizabeth, the beautiful city. This is part 16. And we're starting here with the horse memorial at the juncture of Russell Road and Cape Road. This is one of the probably most idiosyncratic monuments in Port Elizabeth, and it's worth taking a good look at its history. So from my PowerPoint that I did a few years ago, soon after this visit in 2014, I think I put this together in 2015. So, we can establish that it was erected or unveiled by the mayor, Mr. Fetters, in 1905, originally at the juncture of Park Drive and Rink Street, but was moved to a position off Cape Road in 57. And later just relocated a few dozen meters further up that little traffic island. It's a very inappropriate place. But anyway, it's quite visible. The monument's been vandalized numerous times, little bits stolen and, stirrups here and so forth. But there was a serious attack on it in 2015 in which the soldier giving water to the horse was basically ripped off from the plinth. It was later restored, fortunately. The weather wasn't very good. It was pretty overcast when I went here, so the pictures are a bit grey, silhouetted in this case. But here we can see, erected by public subscription with the addition of a liberal donation from the Metropolitan Drinking Fountain and Cattle Trough Association of London. Isn't that an interesting organization there? Drinking Fountain and Cattle Trough Association. Inscribed by the Port Elizabeth branch of the National Council of Women as a tribute to Harriet Mayer, to whose zeal and initiative the city owes this statue. So that was the kind of public-minded, public-spirited person one had back then. Okay, so here's the official thing. I'm sure this has been removed since. But anyway, during the South African War, Port Elizabeth was the main port of entry for remounts for the British forces. Townspeople were very aware of the suffering endured by the horses and mules during the war. Harriet Mayer began the movement for a memorial to these animals and was aided by the above-mentioned association in the UK. The sculptor was Joseph Whitehead, and the statue was cast at Thames Ditton, Surrey, England, first erected in 1905, and it was actually used as a drinking trough when horses were still the main sort of source or method of movement around. It was later relocated in 57. So even silhouetted, it makes quite an impressive image. I think it's beautifully sculpted. I mean, it's so accurate. The greatness of a nation consists not so much in the number of its people or the extent of its territory as in the extent and justice of its compassion. Erected by public subscription in recognition of the services of the gallant animals which perished in the Anglo-Boer War 1899 to 1902. So there you can actually see this was the drinking trough, and the water would have come out there. At the moment, we don't even have water enough to, well, it's impending. I'm speaking here on the, what date is it? 23rd of May, 2022, and our dams are pretty well near empty. So anyway. Not a great backdrop, but anyway. So here, interesting little signature on this thing. Joseph Whitehead, FECIT, London. And apparently FECIT means he, she made it, 1905. Look at that revolting building behind, sort of falling to unpainted. Anyway. So, yeah, pigeons obviously have a field day on this thing. Doves, rather. Quite like the colour that's come through here as the sun started to peek out behind the clouds. I don't know how any right-thinking person can be offended by this memorial, frankly. Somebody giving water to a horse is the least offensive thing possible. The fact that it's a colonial soldier, maybe he was a South African of my sort of vintage, 1820 settlers, which means he would have been here. His ancestors would have come at least sort of 70, 80 years before this. So we move on and back to Whitlock Street, and the first of the Gothic revival churches that we're going to really look at, I think. So the Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Havelock Street. In 1854, dissident members of St. Mary's formed their own church. And the Reverend Robinson arrived in 1857, and this church was built in 1866, with the tower added in 1872. So I've actually done quite a nice, I think, pastel drawing of this, practically this. No, it's a view from the front. This is actually a side elevation. Oh yeah, the church was burned down in 1897 by the same woman who actually burned down St. Mary's. And it was sort of soon afterwards rebuilt again. Look at this lovely stone, concrete and stone, wrought iron fence. Now, unfortunately, I drove past there recently, and there's one of these ugly new modern black fences that has just been erected all around this building. Havelock Square is... The square was part of the Gray Institute grant, originally surveyed in 1856, the oldest house being built in 1862. So this is a really historic place there. We'll get to Havelock Square in a minute. This is still Whitlock Street, and these Whitlock mansions built in 1905. There were earlier settler cottages or townhouses on this site. It's a deep, dark September day, and that's how dark it really was. But there's life in there. And we're going to get to it, I hope. Yeah, now this was one of the typical examples of the loss of a heritage building. 8 Whitlock Street, magnificent cycad tree in the garden, declared a national monument, Victorian semi-detached houses with Regency-style veranda. Now, at this point, despite this gate, fence and everything, I think vagrants were already living in there. You can check the clothes hanging and total dilapidation kicking in. But look at this lovely double-gabled end. Yeah. But if you think this is sad, what they do to it is even sadder. Later, I think we return to this place. Here's those gables. There it is again. Wonderful building. And next to it, a fairly nicely restored or maintained building, but in a rather garish colour, frankly. Parliament Street and Clyde Street. That's Parliament and that's Clyde, and they sort of converge here. And this is actually called Leather Lane. I hadn't realised that. This one down there. I worked next to Leather Lane in London for 2 years. So this is Pine View, this lovely sort of wedge of a building between Ivy Street and Alfred Terrace. And I've done a drawing of this view. It's just that much though, with the top cropped off. But here you get the full splendor of this row in Alfred Terrace, which culminate in the Presbyterian church. I quite like the light in this. It's not, when the sun's out, it's almost too bright and everything sort of glows. And looking further to the right, corner of Whitlock and Parliament Streets. Oh yeah, so this was the building we looked at from that side earlier. That's a corner building. And there, what did I call this building? Pine View, that's right. So that's Pine View. Ivy Street in deep shadow. And the Elaine Hopewell Gallery at this point in time. So there's some nice cottages along Ivy Street. That's George Road coming up on the left. If you back up Ivy Street, slightly better light, you can see those houses. No off-street parking, but I mean a beautiful precinct. It must have been in its heyday, particularly. And there they managed to wedge in a little garage, which, as you can see, immediately detracts from the sort of original cityscape or streetscape, but not too horrendous. We would visit George Street again later, I think. So that's this building here. We see it here, also stunning architecture. Early, looks like sort of 100 years at least. And I think this is just heading down Ivy Street. So built in 1863, as this plaque says there. Look at these wonderful townhouses. So that's looking back up Ivy Street. The light was starting to be lovely. And that's the kind of, it's a lot of work maintaining a building like this with all that lattice work and I don't know if they call this brookie lace, but that's what makes these buildings so impressive. Look at that. Lose that detail and the buildings just become kind of ordinary. So a nice view up Ivy Street. And these are humble little houses, but often at the back, the plots extend quite far in the British sort of style of long, narrow gardens, This oak even owns a boat, which unfortunately he has to keep on the road. Okay, so Belmont Terrace is the one that runs across from left to right here, and then you go down what becomes Ivy Street becomes Victoria Street. Now, unfortunately, it's this area down there that's, and particularly to the right, that's really become run down. So as I'm note here, Belmont Terrace was renamed Athol Fugard Avenue or something in 2017. Now, I'm a great admirer of Fugard's plays, but I think if he had any honesty and integrity, he would have rejected the offer to name a street after, particularly a historic one like Belmont Terrace. I mean, this is one of the earliest streets in PE. Let's say the one in the first 20 or so. And that's looking back down Belmont Terrace to the Donkin Reserve. You can see where the flag is. So it's in the distance. That's the Hill Presbyterian Church. So great architecture, streetscapes, or the character of a street is really determined by the combination of a series of related houses, architecturally sort of complementary, usually built at the same time, and in this case, similar sort of architectural styles. So sad that often that is neglected, View up, Upper Hill Street. Look at the light in this thing. Certainly was a great morning for. And the view down Upper Hill Street towards the sea. Now, this area has also been allowed to deteriorate somewhat. I remember having a friend actually living in a little house down the bottom here in the 80s. I don't know what it's like today. So here you got these quaint, and at this point, not overly concerned with security. I mean, usually everything's just this sort of ugly metal fencing, and at least this row are nice and look almost like the original. That's Upper Hill again. This is what I mean about the security detracting. So George Road, I think we're going to end with this little section here. So former Herald journalist, city councillor and heritage activist Terry Herbst once ran a non-racial restaurant, the Sir Rufane Donkin Rooms, in this building. I think we get a closer look at this. Arrival of the Chapman, 8th of April, 1820. So now that was the ship that my great whatever grandparents were on. Established in 1975, this restaurant. Obviously, the building was a lot older. And that's that same building we saw as we walked down this side, seen from the other side, catching the light nicely. And that's Upper Hill as we look back down George Street and back down Upper Hill. And lovely trees planted down the middle of George Road, not street, road. And finally we're back with Alfred Terrace and that lovely hill Presbyterian. There's a Donkin Row from the back there after the restoration, in inverted commas. And looking up Alfred Terrace, I like the way they've used these bold colors. They seem to have been chosen carefully to complement each other. Bit dark, but at the bottom here, those last buildings here are part of the church. Yeah, they're stone as well. Unfortunately, looking into the sun. And back again up there, looking up Alfred Terrace. And the Donkin Row. And then just a glimpse through of the lighthouse and pyramid and humongously large flag. Yeah, you can never tire of this view up Alfred Terrace. And the view down Constitution Hill, which was still undergoing restoration or renovation or whatever. I think we're going to have to pause it, call it quits at this point, and we're going to resume this journey on the next one. Cheers for now.